The morning of the Allerford wedding, the grey dress was folded at the foot of the servants' stairs, placed there by someone who had not expected anyone to find it. Cecily Vane found it at 7:15. She stood in the narrow corridor between the scullery and the back passage, her own gown still upstairs in the room she had occupied for 6 days as a guest who had not been allowed to forget that the invitation was a courtesy and nothing more. The grey dress belonged to the household. It had belonged to Moret, the under-housekeeper, who had died of a fever in November, and whose belongings had been bundled and distributed among the staff, and the poor box, and the margins of the estate's conscience. Someone had thought to launder it. Someone had folded it here, at the foot of these stairs, and then thought no more about it. Cecily looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the door at the far end of the passage, the one that opened onto the side lane, the lane that led to the village that had a coaching inn, the inn that had a post-chaise that departed for London at 10 o'clock. She took the grey dress upstairs. The wedding of Miss Harriet Allerford to Lord Peveril of Branthwaite was the social event of the autumn season in this corner of Somerset. The Allerford estate sat above the valley on limestone terracing, the old manor house dressed for the occasion in white ribbon and late-cut roses climbing every available lintel and post. 200 guests had arrived. The church would be full by 11. Wedding breakfast afterward would seat 140 in the great hall, with the overflow in the gallery and the morning room, and a string quartet had been engaged from Bath for the dancing that would follow. Cicely had been invited because her mother had been a schoolroom friend of Mrs. R. Allerford's, a friendship that had survived 3 decades of diverging fortunes, and the invitation had been extended in a spirit of remembered warmth rather than present-day relevance. Cecily's father had died the previous spring. Her father's estate was entailed to a cousin she had never met, who had taken up residence before the funeral flowers had wilted. She had come to the Allerford wedding with one good gown and a borrowed traveling box, and the kind of careful composure the people wore when they had nothing left to spend on feelings. She had been placed at the far end of the second table beside the rector's wife and a distant Allerford nephew who spoke exclusively about hunting. She had been introduced, twice, as a companion of Mrs. Allerford's, which was not precisely untrue, and was precisely humiliating, in the particular way that an almost truth can be. She had overheard, on the evening of the 3rd day, Lady Branthwaite, Lord Peveril's formidable mother, installed in the blue drawing-room with the authority of a woman who had never questioned her right to any room she entered, describe her to 2 other women as the charity case from Dorset. The words had been spoken without cruelty, which made them worse. They were an accurate description, Lady Branthwaite seemed to believe. A woman at a wedding with nothing to recommend her, no prospects, no family, no future worth naming, and a borrowed shawl over a gown that was 2 seasons old. A charity case, nothing more. Cecily had stood in the doorway for one full breath, then turned and gone to bed. That had been 3 days ago. Now she pulled the grey dress over her head in the pale early light and found that it fit, roughly, around the shoulders and too loosely in the waist, and that it smelled faintly of the lavender that had been pressed between its folds. She pinned her hair plainly. She left her good gown on the bed, laid flat as if she had stepped out of it mid-air. She left the borrowed shawl. She left the traveling box because it was not truly hers to take, and because the distance to the coaching inn was short and the morning was not cold. She did not leave a note. There was no one she trusted to carry it, and no one she trusted to read it with the care it would have required. She took the grey dress and she walked down the servants' stairs, and she let herself out through the side door into the lane, and no one saw her go. This is where the story ought to end. A woman in a dead servant's uniform, walking alone toward a coaching inn on the morning of a wedding to which she had never truly belonged, and the story should close there, grey and brisk, with the sound of her shoes on the lane and the distant noise of the house behind her beginning to stir. Hugh Allerford had been awake since 5 o'clock. Hugh was the bride's elder brother, recently returned from 3 years in Edinburgh, where he had been occupied with the management of an inheritance considerably more complicated than anyone had expected. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair worn shorter than fashion, strictly required, and a face that had been described, at various points in his life, as difficult to read. He was not difficult. He was careful. There was a difference that most people found inconvenient to observe. He had come back for the wedding because Harriet had asked him, and because he was not the sort of man to refuse his sister on the morning she was to be married. He had come back also because the estate required his attention, and because the quarterly accounts were overdue, and because he could not spend another Edinburgh winter pretending he was comfortable there. He was standing at the kitchen garden gate at 8:15, watching the mist lift off the valley, when he saw the grey dress moving along the lane. He recognized the dress before he recognized the woman in it. The grey dress had belonged to Maid. He had sat with Maid when she was dying because there had been no one else to sit with her, and the grey dress had been what she wore to receive him when she was well enough to receive anyone at all. He knew the cut of the collar, and the set of the sleeves, and the way the fabric caught the light at a particular angle in the early morning. And then the woman in it turned her head briefly to look back at the house. And he saw that it was Miss Vane. He had noticed Miss Vane on her first evening when she had been brought into the drawing-room by his mother, and introduced in the manner his mother used for people she was being generous toward, a manner that was warm in its surface, and quietly diminishing in its architecture. He had noticed the way Miss Vane had received the introduction, which was to say she had received it completely, without allowing any part of her reaction to appear on her face, and he had thought at the time that this required either great dignity or great practice, and that he was uncertain which. He had watched her, across various dinners from the considerable distance of the seat to which she had been assigned. He had watched her listen to the hunting nephew. He had watched her speak briefly with his sister Harriet, and seen the quality of Harriet's attention sharpen in a way it did not sharpen for most people. He had watched her, on the morning of the second day, find one of the Allerford kitchen children crouched behind the stable block in the rain, weeping over a broken toy horse, and crouch beside her in her good gown without any consideration for the mud, and spend 20 minutes in the cold, talking to the child in the low, serious voice of a woman who understood that a child's grief is real. No one else had seen it. He had been returning from the stables and had stopped at the corner of the wall, and watched, and said nothing. He had watched her cross the drawing-room one evening, with a book she had clearly intended to read in the window seat, which she did not do because Lady Branthwaite arrived, and she had retreated so smoothly it might have been a choice. He had not spoken to her. He had not spoken to her because there had not been a moment that was his to take, and because the few moments that had existed had been filled with the business of the estate and the rehearsal dinner, and his mother's requirements and his sister's nerves. Not because he had not wished to. He watched Miss Vane walking away along the lane, in Morate's grey dress with her hair pinned plain and no traveling box and no maid and no one to accompany her, and something in his chest arrived at a conclusion his mind had not quite reached yet. He went inside. He spoke briefly to the head groom. He collected his coat. He did not think about what he would say. He had found in his life that thinking too carefully about what to say was how he ended up saying nothing at all. The lane curved down toward the village, past a stand of beeches that were losing their leaves, in a slow, deliberate fall, the copper and gold of them settling onto the packed earth of the road. Cecily walked through them, her pace even, her hands at her sides. She was not hurrying. Hurrying would suggest flight, and she was not fleeing. She was simply removing herself from a situation she ought never to have entered, and she was doing so in the most efficient manner available. She had reached the far edge of the beeches when she heard the horse. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She listened to the horse's pace slowing, heard it come to a halt somewhere behind her, heard a man dismount. Then she turned. He stood in the lane with his horse's reins in his hand and his coat slightly open at the collar, which suggested he had dressed in some haste. He was looking at her with an expression she could not name, which was not precisely usual, because Cecily was in general skilled at naming expressions. Miss Vane, he said. Mr. Allerford, she said. There was a pause. Your wedding begins in a little under 3 hours, she said, because someone ought to acknowledge it. My sister's wedding, he said. Yes. He looked at her. He looked at the gray dress. He said nothing about the gray dress, which she found unreasonably to be the most decent thing anyone had done for her in quite some time. I have a post-chaise to catch, she said. I know, he said. The 10 o'clock from the 3 Crowns. She looked at him. The head groom mentioned it, he said. You engaged it yesterday afternoon. She had. She had walked to the village herself the previous afternoon, while the other guests were at Harriet's afternoon tea, and she had arranged the post-chaise and paid for it from what remained of the small allowance she had set aside for the journey home, and she had returned in time to dress for dinner, and had said nothing to anyone. There are 3 hours, he said. You do not need to leave yet. I prefer to leave now, she said. He did not argue this. He nodded once as if she had said something reasonable which he supposed she had. Then he said, Will you walk with me? As far as the village, at least the lane is longer than it looks from the house. She looked at him. I am going that direction regardless, he said, which she did not quite believe, but which gave her a reason to accept that was not the real reason, and she appreciated the architecture of the offer. Very well, she said. He fell into step beside her, walking the horse on his other side. The beeches continued for a little longer, and then they gave way to the hedgerow and the open lane and the village beginning to gather itself in the valley below. The morning smelled of autumn grass and the distant smoke from the inn's chimney. She was aware of him in the way she had been aware of him at dinner, in the way she had been aware of him each time he had crossed a room she occupied, which was the particular awareness of a woman who has told herself firmly not to notice something and thereby noticed it at every available opportunity. He was tall, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had learned to take up space without apology. He said nothing for several minutes, which she also appreciated because she was not in the mood to be asked questions. She would have to answer carefully. They were perhaps a quarter-mile from the village when he said, The dress? She waited. Marat was a good woman, he said. She kept her counsel. And she worked without complaint, and she knew every corner of this house better than anyone living, including me. He paused. She would have been pleased, I think, that it was useful to someone, Cecily said. I will send it back. I know you will, he said. Another silence. My mother, he said, and stopped. She waited again. My mother is a woman who is comfortable with her own certainties, he said. She has not been made uncomfortable very often, and when she is, she attributes the discomfort to an error in the world, rather than to a limitation in herself. He said it levelly, without apology and without the kind of pointed emphasis that would have made it a performance. She was wrong about you. I expect she is aware of it on some level, though she would not say so. Cecily looked at the village below. The inn sign was visible now. She called you a charity case, he said. I heard her. I should have corrected her. Cecily stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to face her, and the horse stopped alongside them with the patient tolerance of a well-trained animal. You should not feel obligated to correct your mother on my behalf, she said. No, he said. I should correct her because she was wrong. He looked at her steadily. The morning light was doing something particular to his face, rendering it less careful than usual. Or perhaps she was only looking more carefully than usual. You are not a charity case, Miss Vane. You are a woman who has lost a great deal this year, through no action of your own, and who has conducted herself with more dignity than most people manage when everything is in their favor. End quote. He paused. That is not the same thing. She was aware distantly of a warmth across her breastbone that had nothing to do with the morning air. You have been watching me, she said. Yes, he said, without any attempt at denial. Why, she said. He looked at the horse for a moment. Then he looked at her. Because you were worth watching, he said, And because I had not yet found a way to—" He stopped. He tried again. "I am not practiced at this," he said. Edinburgh did not prepare me for this particular problem. Something in her chest felt, for the first time in a long time, as though it might crack in a direction she had not expected. "What problem is that?" she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "The problem," he said, "of wanting to speak to someone every hour for 6 days, and finding, each time, that someone else had already made it impossible." He looked at her. "Lady Branthwaite, the hunting nephew, my own sister's dinner table. I'm beginning to think the universe arranged these obstacles with deliberate intention." She almost smiled. She caught it. "You are going to miss your sister's wedding," she said. "I will be back in time," he said. "I have a horse, Mr. Alliford," she said. "Hugh," he said quietly, and the name in his own voice offered to her in a lane in Somerset, with the leaves falling around them, was so different from anything she had expected to hear that she had to look away for a moment. "I am going to London," she said. "I have very little money, and I am going to stay with my aunt in Cheapside while I look for a situation, because there is no estate to return to and no family to support me, and that is the shape of my life at present." She said it plainly because he had spoken plainly to her, and she owed him the same courtesy. "Whatever you are trying to say to me, you should say it with full knowledge of that." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Harriet told me," he said, "the day after you arrived. She was indignant on your behalf. She is a woman of strong feeling." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something earlier than a smile. "She also told me your father had been a particular kind of man. Honest. Good company. The sort of man who read his daughter's Latin instead of embroidery patterns." He paused. "I would have liked to know him." Cecily looked at the ground. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. Her father had read her Latin. He had read her Cicero in the afternoons when the light came through the study window in long flat bars, and she had sat on the window seat with her feet tucked under her and followed the words with her finger in the dust of the ledge. And he had said, once, that the only thing more useful than a woman who could think was a woman who knew that she could. She had carried that sentence for 6 months like a coal held inside a closed fist, warmth and burn together. "Miss Vane," Hugh said. She looked up. "I am asking if you will write to me," he said. "From London. I am asking if you will permit me to write to you. I am asking also if you would consider returning to Somerset in the spring as a guest. Rather than a courtesy, with enough time to walk the estate and have dinner at an hour when the table is not arranged to make conversation impossible." He said it carefully, and she could see the care in it, the same quality she had observed in him across 6 dinners. The quality that was not coldness but precision, a man who chose each word because he meant it, rather than because it would produce an effect. "I am not asking you to change your plans for London. I am asking if there is room, at the edges of those plans, for correspondence with a man who has spent 6 days wanting to talk to you and failing badly at it." The Coach-and-Yin sign swung in the morning breeze below them. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Maire's gray dress. She thought about the side door in the lane and the intention with which she had walked out of a house that had never quite held a place for her. She thought about her aunt in Cheapside, who was a good woman and a small house, and the classified notices she had already begun to compose in her head, governess or companion or any situation requiring French and Latin and the ability to manage a household account. She thought about him standing at a kitchen garden gate at 8:15, watching the mist lift off the valley. "The post-chaise leaves at 10, she said. "I know," he said. "I will miss it if I am not at the inn by 9:30. "I know. You have a wedding to attend." "I have approximately 40 minutes, he said, before I am required to be anywhere." She looked at the lane. She looked at him. She said, "There is a bench at the edge of the inn yard." He looked at her. "If you are going to spend the next 6 months writing letters, she said. "You had better make certain we have something to say to each other first." He let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh. It was something earlier than that, something she suspected he did not let happen often. And it arrived on his face with the force of a thing long held back, and she felt it somewhere behind her sternum, warm and precise. They walked the rest of the way to the village together, his horse between them and the morning coming down around them in a drift of leaves. And by the time they reached the inn yard, she had learned that he had been in Edinburgh managing an agricultural trust left by an uncle who had also, incidentally, left a complicated personal library, and that the library was the reason the trust had taken 3 years instead of 1, because he had been unwilling to simply have it auctioned, and that he was still deciding what to do with 7 crates of books that were currently occupying a spare room at Allerford. She told him that her father had left her 3 things: his watch, a volume of Cicero with his annotations in the margins, and the knowledge of how to keep a household account in a way that held up to scrutiny. She told him with a dryness that surprised her in the saying that the watch was the only one of these she could sell. He said without any excess of feeling that the household accounts for Allerford had not been properly audited in 2 years, and that the current steward was not a dishonest man but was a disorganized one, and that the quarterly figures had been keeping him awake since his return. She looked at him. "I am not offering you a situation," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I am telling you," he said carefully, "that there are reasons beyond the personal that I would be very glad of your correspondence, and that the personal reasons are also real." They sat on the bench at the edge of the inn yard, and the inn stable boy moved horses in and out of the yard with the cheerful industry of a boy who was not paying attention to anyone seated in his vicinity. And the morning opened around them, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to be spoken to as though what you know matters." She had not known she was waiting for it. She had thought, in the months since her father's death, that what she was waiting for was a situation, a household, a position with a clear title and a clear wage and a set of duties she could fulfill. She had thought she was waiting for stability, for the particular relief of not having to think about where she would sleep next month. That was true. It was also not all of it. She was waiting to be spoken to as though what she knew mattered. And now someone had, in a lane in Somerset, in a dead woman's grey dress, on the morning of a wedding she had dressed to avoid, and it felt like cold water after a long walk, clarifying rather than overwhelming. They talked until 9:15, when the inn's ostler began to hitch the post-chaise horses, and the matter became concrete. He rose from the bench first. She rose after him. They stood in the inn yard with the cold morning around them, and the post-chaise horses making the ordinary sounds of horses on cold cobblestones. "I will write," he said. "I will write back," she said. He held out his hand. She took it and felt his fingers close around hers with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing to close them, not by habit or courtesy but by choice, and the warmth of it stayed in her palm as she climbed into the post-chaise, and the door was shut and the vehicle began to move. If you have ever wished that someone would look at you exactly as you are, without apology for the dress, without condescension for the borrowed shawl, without the careful diminishment that charity can carry inside it, leave a word below, because this story knows that feeling. And so, it seems, did she. She did not look back through the post-chaise window. She had looked back once already, in the lane, and once had been enough to show her what was there. The drive to London took 2 days, with a change of horses at Frome and a night at Beckington, and she spent most of the first day watching the Somerset countryside pass and thinking about 7 crates of books in a spare room, and a quarterly account that did not add up. And she was aware that this was not the thinking of a woman who had cleanly removed herself from a situation. She arrived at her aunt's house in Cheapside on the evening of the 2nd day, and her aunt opened the door herself, because her aunt was that kind of woman, and said, "Cecily, you look—" She stopped, because what she saw in Cecily's face was not what she had expected. "I am well," Cecily said. "You look different," her aunt said. "I am well," Cecily said again. She was. His first letter arrived 11 days later, addressed in a hand that was clear and small and did not waste space. It was for pages. It concerned in its first 2 pages the household accounts and the specific nature of the steward's disorganization, which she had asked about in her own letter, sent from Beckington, trusting that it would reach Allerford before his own letter left. It concerned in its 3rd page the Edinburgh Library, and the question of what to do with a collection of botanical texts that appeared to have belonged to someone who had made a life's work of studying a very specific marsh grass. It concerned in its 4th page the following morning in the particular light of a November that had arrived quickly, and the way the kitchen garden looked with the first frost on it, and the bench at the inn yard which he had walked past on Tuesday on his way to settle a matter with the blacksmith, and which he had not, he wrote, been able to pass without observing. She read it twice. Then she began her reply. In the months that followed, she found a situation as a lady's companion to a Mrs. Drayton in Holborn, a widow of mild temperament and excellent library, who asked little more of her than conversation on rainy afternoons and the occasional accounting of household expenses, for which Cecily had the training, and for which Mrs. Drayton paid a wage that was small but sufficient. She managed. She had always been able to manage. And the letters came, and she answered them, and the letters grew longer, and then shorter, and then longer again. In a rhythm she began to recognize the shorter ones, arriving when something had demanded his attention and he had sat down to write anyway, the longer ones arriving on Sundays, which she noticed and did not remark upon, and noted privately, with a warmth she did not name, to anyone. He wrote about the estate, with the same precision he brought to everything else, the steward's errors, the autumn harvest, the kitchen garden's slow recovery from a late frost, the problem of a disputed field boundary with the neighboring farm that had been disputed for 30 years, and seemed likely to be disputed for 30 more. He wrote, in December, a single paragraph about Harriet's first letter from Branthwaite, which reported that Lord Peveril was perfectly attentive, and that Lady Branthwaite had been installed in the East Wing and was, in Harriet's measured phrase, becoming adjusted to her new circumstances. He wrote, at the bottom of the December letter, in what seemed to be an afterthought but she had begun to understand was never an afterthought with him, that he hoped she was warm enough in Holborn, and that if the Drayton household's supply of coal was insufficient he wished she would say so. He came to London in February. He did not announce it. His second-to-last letter had mentioned business with a solicitor in the city, and nothing more, and she had taken this at face value. And then on a Wednesday afternoon Mrs. Sickenin, Drayton's parlour-maid, had brought her a card on which was written, in the clear, small hand she had come to know, Hugh Allerford, and beneath it, in brackets, the solicitor is finished. She had gone down. He was in the hallway, his hat in his hand, looking exactly as he had looked in the lane in Somerset, which was to say, he looked like himself, which was becoming, she was finding, the thing she most wished to look at in any room. They walked along the embankment for 2 hours. It was cold, and the river was gray, and there were no beech trees. But the quality of attention was the same, the kind that listened to what she said and returned it without alteration. And she talked about Mrs. Drayton and the Botanical Library and a volume of Virgil she had found in a second-hand bookseller's in Holborn that had someone else's schoolboy annotations in the margins, and he listened. Then he told her about the quarterly accounts. She had helped him across the winter letters to identify where the steward's records had diverged from the actual expenditure, and the gap was not enormous, but it was consistent, and it was consistent in a direction that suggested either error or habit. And he had brought the matter to a head with the steward in January, and the steward had resigned, and he had spent February with a solicitor, and now the accounts were clear. They are clear in part because of you, he said levelly, with the plain acknowledgment he gave to facts. She said, I did very little. He said, you identified the pattern in the second letter. This was true. She had looked at the figures he had transcribed and seen immediately what was wrong. The same way she had seen, when she was 15, what was wrong with her father's land agent's receipts, which had turned out to be rather a great deal wrong, but that was another story. They stopped at a wall above the river. The afternoon was dropping toward dusk, the light going gray and gold at the horizon. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. She had learned that waiting was the correct response to this particular register in his voice. "I want to ask you to come back to Somerset," he said. "Not as a guest, not as a companion. I am asking you to come back as—" He stopped. He turned to face her, with the directness she had come to understand was not coldness, but the opposite of it. A precision that was his form of care. "I am asking you to marry me, Cecily. I am aware of all the things you told me in the lane. I have thought about nothing else since the lane." He paused. "I am asking you anyway." The river moved below them, gray and patient. She thought about the gray dress, folded at the foot of the servants' stairs. She thought about the side door and the lane, and the intention with which she had walked out of a house she had never belonged to. She thought about belonging, and how rarely she had done it, and how different it felt to be asked to belong somewhere by someone who had listened, first to every reason she might refuse. "You could have asked me in Somerset," she said. "I know," he said. "I should have." He looked at the river. "I was afraid you would say yes before you had enough reason to mean it." She looked at him. She said, "I have 7 months of letters." "Yes," he said. "And 2 hours on an embankment in February." "Yes, and a lane in Somerset," she said, "and a bench at an inn-yard." "Yes," he said. She looked at the river for a moment. Then she said, "I think that is enough reason to mean it." His breath went out of him, not quite a sound, the body's private acknowledgement of something. The face was only beginning to allow, he said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He did not sweep her into any dramatic embrace. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. And the embankment in February was not the setting for it. What he did was take her hand, the way he had taken it in the inn-yard in Somerset, with the same deliberateness, the same quality of choosing, and hold it for a long moment, and she felt the cold of the air and the warmth of his hand and the river going past below them. And she thought, simply. They were married in the spring. Not at Allerford, which would have produced a guest list with Lady Branthwaite on it, and neither of them wished for that particular audience. They were married at the church in Cecily's mother's village, which was a small church with clear windows and a vicar who had christened Cecily, and who cried quietly throughout the entire ceremony, and was not remotely embarrassed about it. Harriet Allerford was present, radiant in her first months of marriage to Lord Peveril, who had turned out to be a perfectly decent man once removed from his mother's immediate orbit. Mrs. Drayton came and sat in the third pew, and cried also. More publicly, Cecily wore white. She had bought the gown herself from a dressmaker on Holborn High Street, and paid for it with 3 months of carefully saved wages, and it fit her properly, at the shoulders and in the waist. She thought once briefly about the gray dress, which she had laundered and pressed and returned to Allerford by carrier in October, with a brief note expressing gratitude and respect. She had thought at the time that it was the end of the thing the gray dress had started. She understood now that it was closer to the beginning. They settled at Allerford in May, when the grounds were at their best, and the kitchen garden had begun its determined re-emergence after the winter. The 7 crates of books were still in the spare room. She had a desk in the study that had been her father-in-law's, which Hugh had cleared with no ceremony and arranged for her without fanfare on the morning she arrived. A clean surface, a good pen. The window turned to catch the morning light. The housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Croft, who had managed Allerford through 2 generations and knew every corner of it, had met her at the door with the expression of a woman reserving judgment, and by the end of the first week had given her a set of household keys and the brief, dry observation that the linen inventory had not been properly updated since the previous Lady Allerford's time, and that someone with a clear hand and a steady head might wish to see to it. Cecily had begun the linen inventory that afternoon. Mrs. Croft had watched her work for a long moment, and then brought her tea, without being asked. The quarterly accounts were on the desk when she sat down. She looked at them. She looked at the window, which faced the kitchen garden and the valley beyond it, the valley filling up with green in the May morning, the limestone terracing of the estate golden in the early light. She had known houses that had not held her. She had known how a room could be beautiful and still feel like a borrowed coat, slightly wrong in the shoulders, 2 inches short at the hem. This did not feel like that. She opened the quarterly accounts. She took out a sheet of paper. She began. By midsummer, the accounts were clear, and a new steward had been appointed on her recommendation, and the library question had been partially resolved, which is to say that the botanical texts had gone to a society in London that was very pleased to have them, and that she and Hugh had kept the rest for themselves. The shelves lining the corridor to the morning room now dense with a combined collection that she thought her father would have liked to browse on an afternoon when the light came through the windows in long, flat bars. She found the Cicero one evening in August, her father's volume, the one with his annotations in the margins. She had brought it from London in her traveling box. She had not looked at it in months. She sat in the window seat of the morning room, with the long summer evening going gold outside, and read a page she had not read since the spring before her father died. And his voice was in the margins, small and precise and unrepeatable. She sat there for a long time. Hugh came in at some point without announcing himself, as he had a habit of doing, and sat down at the other end of the window seat with a sheaf of correspondence, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet together when the quiet is a kind of conversation. After a while he said, without looking up, "Your father was right, you know." She looked at him. He looked at her. Harriet told me what he said about thinking. He said it simply, with the same precision he brought to facts. She looked at the evening outside the window. The valley was going quiet, the light thickening toward gold, the kitchen garden settling into its summer certainty. She said, "I know." The Cicero stayed open in her lap, her father's handwriting in the margins, small and clear, in the evening light. Outside the garden held its ground.